This is the 65th donation by Isaac and Yolanda Melman. They've been donating wonderful works of art to the museum for over the past 10 years, often with a focus on 19th century French Impressionism. But this is arguably the greatest single acquisition that they've ever given the museum here at Oglethorpe. For those of you who have been here a few years, you may be familiar with the practice with our previous administration. Our former president, Larry Shaw, would often meet Isaac Melman for coffee at Starbucks or breakfast at Waffle House. And after their meal, Isaac would pop his trunk and pull out a Cezanne or Degas or Renoir. But with this particular piece, Elizabeth and I saw this about 2.5 years ago at his home. We were working on the Chagall exhibition, which Elizabeth will stage later this year. And as collectors often do, they say, well, step into my study, I'll show you something special. And this wonderful Degas was in Isaac's study. We had no idea he was already considering a gift of the piece to the museum. But a year later, he called Elizabeth and said, come over and get it. I'm not going to bring it to Waffle House. But this, again, is a wonderful drawing in black charcoal, dating to around 1884. The original is right behind you. I hate to use a digital surrogate when the original is right here, but for the purpose of this presentation, I think it's best. The work is entitled Femme, assise, woman with drawing from bath, wiping the towel, 1884. This is not a signature, this is the estate stamp. So we know this was in Degas' possession when he died in 1917. And so the title is Degas in his studio, and it's a bit misleading because we're not only going to talk about studio practices, but we're also going to talk a good bit about what happened to that studio after 1917. And oftentimes artist studios are very important as part of their estate dissolution, and the fact that those works are often sold in a very systematic way after the death of the artist, which facilitates something like an estate stamp to document that every piece in the studio was certified as being in that premise at the time of the death of the artist. But before we go into the lecture, I just want to give a couple of updates because this is the first lecture I've had here in almost 2 years. So we're very happy to be here to talk to you all. In the upcoming future, next year, we're going to be staging an exhibition co-curated by Professor Jalot and myself, The Idyll Before the Storm, French Rococo Art of the 18th Century. And we've just gotten confirmation this week that this wonderful drawing by Jean-Baptiste Patet will be loaned to the exhibition. It's currently in the stock of Stephen Almington's gallery in London. And so he'll be shipping that to Atlanta next year, as well as a wonderful piece by Boudry, which we've also found out. We've just been given permission to borrow. We'll pair these things with 18th century French porcelain examples by Sèvres, Vincent, and others to give an illustration of art and culture in the first half of the 17th century in France. And then in April, Haley Stono, who's a current senior, will be translating her honors thesis on undervalued female British artists 1880 to 1920 into an exhibition here at the museum in the Center Gallery. And this is one of 10 works that will be in that exhibition. This is a rather wonderful sketch of Ramsay by Bibiana Triquer. It's a portrait of the artist's son, dating to 1890. Phoebe Triquer was the first woman elected to the Royal Scottish Academy and was one of the most influential female British artists of the late 19th and early 20th century. So these are the kinds of artists that Haley Stono will be focusing on in her research and in the subsequent exhibition. Now, when Degas died in 1917, living in a flat with his niece, there really was no studio as we would consider it today. It was described by Mary Cassatt and Degas' niece as a series of unlit rooms. We think about 3 rooms that were simply filled floor to ceiling with boxes of drawings, paintings, prints, and other ephemera. These are the original auction catalogs from the 8 auctions that were staged between 1918 and 1919. But this was never supposed to happen, because in Degas' last will and testament, he left instructions that the executors of his estate should burn 1,000 pieces of art that were in his possession at the time of his death. They were either unfinished or he considered them subpar. That's a bit tongue-in-cheek. I think artists sometimes like to be a bit melodramatic. Fortunately, the executors of the estate, including Julie Manet's husband, who was Berthe Morisot's son-in-law, he was one of the individuals who came forward along with the nieces of Degas and said, we're not going to do this. We're going to preserve the artistic legacy of Edgar Degas. And so they had 8 sales between 1918 and 1919. There were over 1,000 paintings, drawings, and prints and pastels by Degas, as well as an incredible collection of work by other artists that Degas admired, especially works by Ingres and Manet and others, including Van Gogh. And so throughout those 8 auctions held over the course of 2 years, the sales fetched 10.8 million francs, which is about $1.8 million in 1919 money. It's bittersweet that the sales happened in 1918, 1919. In 1920, there was an enormous drop in depression in the value of the franc against the American dollar. And so great American collectors like Louisine Hevemeyer, who we're going to be looking at later, she could have gotten a lot more for her money. But the franc dropped from around 17 cents to about 6 cents within a year. But the sales happened before that, so the Degas heirs made an enormous amount of money. But the Degas heirs were careful and shrewd. They didn't sell everything. They held on to certain things. We'll be looking at those later. But what's so tantalizing is that in the exhibition catalogs, you see charcoal female nudes very similar to the ones here at Oglethorpe University. And so we're trying to locate our own examples of these catalogs so we can reconcile them against the charcoal that's here in the gallery today. The stamp on the far right is the estate stamp. This is the stamp that was created when Degas died, and all 1,000 pieces in that studio were stamped with that image to prove that they were in the studio at the time of his death. Now, I'm showing this illustration because the sale of Degas' studio was one of the greatest auctions of all times. It was one of the greatest artist studio liquidations ever. And the only thing that comes comparable is the estate of Pablo Picasso. When Pablo Picasso died in the 1970s, there were a large number of individuals at play wanting to claim a stake of the estate. Picasso had had 2 legal wives, a number of mistresses, lots of children, and it became a very messy legal battle that took years to settle. The other problem was that most of Picasso's estate was in the form of real estate. He owned villas all throughout Europe, and every villa was packed full of thousands upon thousands of drawings, paintings, ceramics, and prints. So the entire collection had to be cataloged before the lawyers could even begin to decide who would get what. But if any of you saw this incredible exhibition of Calder Picasso at the High earlier this year, you saw a lot of works by Picasso that were part of that artist studio liquidation, so to speak, that were given to multiple members of the Picasso family, including the grandson who co-curated this exhibition, as part of their inheritance. And so as a result, a number of those works ended up in the Picasso Museum in Paris and the Picasso Museum in Spain. Because when Picasso died, not only did he have a lot of real estate and art, he had very little cash. And so when they divided the estate of Picasso, after all of this art was divided up, who got the largest share of the Picasso estate? Was it his eldest son? Was it his living wife? Was it his illegitimate children, or someone else? Who was it? It was the French government. They took the biggest cut. And the family decided, because they didn't have the millions of euros rather, to settle the francs to settle the state tax debt, the French government said, if you give us X number of works of art, we'll establish the Picasso Museum in Paris, and you won't owe any taxes. And there was still enormous numbers of works of art to divide amongst the family. And the Picasso heirs and heiresses today are some of the wealthiest members of European communities because of that estate. Because after Picasso's death, his work has continued to escalate in value. And you see, we're going to be looking at this later in the lecture, an enormous gender inequality between artists like Picasso and his female counterparts. The women are still not performing as well as the men in the marketplace today. But getting back to Edgar Degas, he was actually not entirely French. He was French-American. His father was Auguste, here on the left, and his mother was Marie Celestine Mousson Degas, her married name. She was born and raised in Louisiana, in New Orleans, and the Degas family maintained continual presences in Louisiana. They had a lot of interest in the cotton trade in the American South. And when Degas went to the United States, one and only time, in 1873, he only painted one picture. He didn't like the United States. He thought it was rather mercantile and dull and boring. And so he painted this image of the cotton office in New Orleans, 1873. One shudders to think what he would have created if he had let his hair down and actually explore the beautiful domains of the southern United States. But Degas' father was born in Naples. His grandfather was a prominent banker, and the family had branches in Italy and in France. And Auguste really indulged his eldest son, Edgar, and really subsidized his living for many, many years. So Degas was anything but the starving artist that many people might consider. But later, when Auguste dies, the family banking firm is in disarray. Other members of the Degas family have huge debts. And so for the first time in his life, Degas is going to have to look upon his artistic production as a means of a wage-earning system, a way to make a living. And there's a very important American female that's going to come on the scene that helps a great deal. But early on, when he was a student in France, he was heavily influenced by artists like Ingres, who would encourage him to copy the old masters. Degas was not the bad boy of the art world. He was actually quite conservative and traditional in many ways. He was obsessed with the art of picture making, the craft of fabrication of his work, and he started at the very bottom and worked up. So some of you may recognize this work as Anne of Cleves by Hans Holbein, one of the short wives of Henry VIII. She survived with her head, but there was a divorce. And so Degas is copying this picture, which is a pretty good likeness to the original by Hans Holbein. This was an even greater feat. This is The Rape of the Sabine Women by Nicolas Poussin, the great 17th century French master. And many people felt this was one of the most faithful copies ever created, and this dates to the 1860s. So here in the self-portrait of Degas on the left probably dates to around the 1850s, and on the right from the 1870s, a very fashionable and chic Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt was born in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, to a very wealthy mercantile banking family who would continue to expand their wealth and their privilege. When she was 7 years old, she went to France to live for 4 years with her family, which was not unusual for upper middle class Americans to go to Europe to absorb art and culture. She loved Europe. She really did not like the United States when she came back. She thought it really did not compare to what she had seen. Although she did join the Philadelphia Academy of Design, the artistic school in Philadelphia, and she appreciated it, but she found that the public art collections in the United States were incredibly lacking, nothing like what she was seeing in France, Germany, and Italy, and that would stick with her for the rest of her life. But Cassatt was fiercely independent. She was very strong-willed. Her father hated the idea of her being an artist. He really did not want to support the endeavor. He thought that she should marry a good man, live a very comfortable life, and become, quote, a good housekeeper like the rest of her circle. And she would have none of that. And so she fought voraciously against her father's wish for her to maintain a more conservative way of life. And this was the man himself. This is Robert and Catherine Johnson Cassatt, both painted by Mary Cassatt. Later in life, because Mary Cassatt was such a force with which to be reckoned, the parents gave in. And ultimately, the parents would move to France to live with Mary Cassatt, because in the end, she was, I won't say she was the matriarch of the family. Her brother was very successful in his industries with banking, but I think she was a very anchoring presence in the family. So not only did her parents live with her, but also her sister, who was a huge influence in her life. Because in the 1870s, you have this painting at Renoir's home by Renoir, 1876. In the middle, you have Georges Rivière, the great art critic. And you see a lot of the young Impressionists, including a not-so-young Pissarro in the back right, who's the eldest of all the Impressionists. This was a very male-dominated world, and Cassatt again and again would overcome those boundaries and those challenges, but this is what most people thought of when they thought of Impressionism. By 1870, Degas is beginning to break into his own style. This is a detail from the orchestra at the Opera of 1870. It's now in the collections of the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. But what's important about this painting is that in 1870, Degas begins to pay attention to the ballerinas in the background, the dancers. And that type of subject will continue to obsess him for the rest of his life. He was very interested in dancers, in prostitutes, in jockeys and racehorses. Very unusual mixture of subject matter. But he really did not care for formal bourgeois portraiture. He did not care for the upper classes necessarily. He really defied his father's way of life of banking, where everything was given a price tag, everything was commodified. That was not something he liked. But he was happy to take the money every month, so he lived this comfortable life as an artist. Now in 1874, that group of ragtag artists, which were not even considered a cohesive group, they were not called the Impressionists. It was the Society of Anonymous Artists, paraphrasing that title for people who my French is terrible. But this is the exhibition catalog for the first exhibition in 1874. It was held in this building. This is the studio of Nadar, who began his life as a caricaturist. And when photography became very prominent in the second half of the 19th century, unlike a lot of artists, Nadar switched to photography and became very successful. And so he was happy to help a younger generation of struggling artists by giving them free studio space for an exhibition. And this is André Daumier's wonderful Nadar elevating photography to the height of art. Another key figure in the Impressionist movement is this gentleman, Durand-Ruel, excuse me, who was one of the first dealers to take the group seriously. In the 1870s, a lot of these early Impressionist exhibitions were not well received. It was not a financial success, and a number of the artists had enormous financial difficulty. They had families to support. Degas was not one of them. He never married. Mary Cassatt was not one of them, and Rosa neither was one of them, because they were all three very wealthy individuals. But Durand-Ruel would subsidize the group for many, many years. He literally bought thousands of paintings by Monet, Renoir, Degas, Pissarro, and others. And you see this wonderful sympathetic portrait by Renoir on the left. And on the right, you see Durand-Ruel in his Paris gallery. He'll eventually open branches in London and New York, because eventually Impressionism takes off and people like it and they start to buy it. And what's interesting is that he did open a branch in London. We often think the British are very conservative in their artistic taste, but Impressionism actually fared very well in places like Birmingham, England, and in Newcastle rather, in these industrial towns where you had a very new, burgeoning middle class of individuals who were making a lot of money from the textiles trade, from the iron trade, a lot of industry. And they liked these beautiful, idyllic, light, colorful images that took them away from the grip and the grime of a mill town, which if you've ever been to the north part of England, imagine what it was like 100 years ago. It was not a very pleasant place. But these owners who were making huge amounts of money off the toil of thousands would spend huge sums of money on a Degas or And here you see Durand-Ruel really enjoying the fruits of his labor. This is just one of the rooms in his chateau. You have this magnificent large-scale Renoir, and there's a Cassatt in the corner as well. But again, he literally bought thousands upon thousands of these things. His gallery would also go on in 1919 to buy the charcoal drawing in this gallery. In 1868, Degas created one of his most puzzling paintings. Degas was not the nicest of people. He was not chummy and chatty. He had very specific ideas about a lot of different people. He didn't care for women necessarily, and he never married. But he painted this work in 1868 entitled Interior. Scholars have debated the meaning of it. Most recently, people believe that it's based on Émile Zola's novel Thérèse Rapin, which you have a young woman here who's about to enter into a sexual act with the gentleman on the right. You have a case, a box that's lying in rich pink velvet with a white cloth from which a portion has been cut by the scissors on the table. It has very strong sexual overtones and shows a great deal of sexual aggression that's about to happen. Mary Cassatt came into the picture in the 1870s. She begins a lifelong friendship with Degas. The relationship was never physical. They were simply friends, although there were many times when they couldn't stand each other. But they were great artists, and they respected one another as great artists. We believe these two pictures were painted very close to one another in terms of time. The piece on the left is a self-portrait by Mary Cassatt. The piece on the right is a less forgiving portrait of Cassatt by Edgar Degas. And it really shows the way he saw her and how she saw herself. Again, she was highly educated, incredibly self-confident, very opinionated, and she loved great fashion. So she just had everything going for her. But she and Degas really felt like they were kindred spirits. Degas once said that when a woman paints a picture, it looks like someone trimming a hat, unless you're Mary Cassatt. In 1878, Mary Cassatt had a rude awakening. Up until this point, she had been well received by the Salon in France. She was one of the first Americans to be shown at the Salon. She was even shown before Thomas Aiken, who was there studying and working alongside her. But in the later part of the 1870s, the Academy decided they no longer liked her style, and she decided she no longer liked the salon. And so she no longer wanted to participate in these juried exhibitions, and at the same time, Edgar Degas said, why don't you exhibit with us? We think this painting was exhibited at the 4th Impressionist exhibition. It's entitled Little Girl in Blue Chair. It was eventually acquired by the great American collector Chester Dale and then given to the nation at the National Gallery. What's interesting about it is that there are passages, because people have really studied this painting to no end. It's often thought that this area was actually painted by Degas. Don't ask me why or how, but this is what scholars continue to debate about. But the fact that they might have actually worked alongside one another is not altogether impossible, because again, we think these pictures were actually painted in the same room on the same day, but we're not entirely sure. Now, another female character, and keep in mind, I'm telling this narrative with a feminist perspective and then, because that's something we ought to be doing more of. There were a lot of women in Degas' life that played very important roles. Not only was there Mary Cassatt, but this woman played an equally important role. Her name was Louisine Elder Havemeyer. When she was 22 years old, her father had died, and she was one of the wealthiest heiresses in the country, the United States. And like a lot of wealthy Americans, she would go to France. And it was a small closed circle. And Louisine was introduced to Mary Cassatt because they were of the same social ilk, so it was appropriate for the two women to know one another. She was 22 years old. She was about to be married. Her mother decided that the best way to preserve Louisine's fortune was to marry her to a man 24 years her senior, who was Louisine's late father's business partner. And he was called the Sugar King, Mr. Havemeyer. They refined sugar, and they made huge sums of money. So Louisine took her fortune, combined it with Mr. Havemeyer, and boom, voila, great American art collector was born. She's 22 years old. She and Mary Cassatt are walking around Paris, sightseeing. There are a few different versions to the story. One version goes that she had an allowance of $75 a week or a month. A lot of money back then. Another story goes she borrowed $100 from her sisters. At any rate, she went into what she called a color shop, an art supply store. And as was the case at the time, art supply stores often had small galleries of art that could be sold, often by up-and-coming artists. And there was a wonderful little pastel over monotype entitled The Rehearsal. We're going to go into the technical aspects of monotype in a bit. This is about 22 by 28 inches. You basically have a monotype print, and then it's finished with pastel on the top. Louisine saw this, and she said she had no idea how to respond to it. It frightened her, but it amazed her. She didn't know why she wanted it, but she thought she should get it. And she also had Mary Cassatt tugging at her shoulder saying, buy the damn thing. She bought it for about $75 or $100. It was the first piece. When Louisine Havemeyer died, she bequeathed 2,000 works of art to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but not this one. This one was important and special. A lot of her things were important and special, but this was very special from a sentimental point of view, because this was the first piece that Louisine ever bought. So she left it to her daughter, who then left it to her son, the grandson. He sold it in California in, I think, the 1960s. Norton Simon, who was then a great American collector about to form his own museum on the West Coast, bought it from the grandson or the heirs of the grandson. It's still not entirely clear. He paid $410,000 for it. Simon then, a few years later, decides he wants to sell a few of his pieces to focus more on Asian art. So he sends 10 pictures, including The Rehearsal, to Sotheby's. This sells for $780,000 in 1973. It was bought by Marlborough Gallery. Marlborough then sells it for about $1.1 million to a Mrs. Spencer, who was a great patron of the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, Missouri. And that's where the piece lives to this day. But I love this piece because this is the beginning of an incredible adventure that Louisine will have with Mary Cassatt and with her husband. So you have a portrait of Louisine in later years on the left, in middle age on the right with her daughter, painted by Mary Cassatt. Louisine was not only one of the greatest art collectors of her day, she was also, like Mary Cassatt, very strong-willed, independent, and she became one of the most important suffragettes of the 20th century. But she and Mary Cassatt had a plan. When they bought that first picture at the art shop, Mary Cassatt remembered how much she hated the lack of good public art collections in the United States. And so she said to Louisine, you and your husband are going to build a great art collection. Other friends of mine who have plenty of money are going to do the same thing. And then when all of you ascend into heaven and die, I want you to leave everything to public museums around the United States of America. And that's exactly what they did for the most part. Now, getting back to monotype. This is a wonderful landscape, monotype de pastel. It lives about 6 miles down the road. It's at the High Museum. It dates to 1892. 1892, Degas is traveling throughout the French countryside for the summer. And he hasn't really painted pastels for about 20 to 30 years. He painted a lot in the 1860s. By the 1890s, he decides, I think I'm going to try this again. We're not quite sure why he returned to pastels. We have a few ideas. But on that journey throughout the French countryside in the summer, he was often in a train. And he would look at moving landscapes. And he would make mental notes, maybe some sketches. But mostly, he draws from memory. He doesn't like to draw from an exact translation of the subject. And he's been experimenting, as has Mary Cassatt, with printmaking. And so with monotype, you ink the plate here, and you place a damp sheet of paper on top of it, you run it through a press, or you place a rolling pin over it evenly, and you pull back the top sheet, and you have a mirror reflection, and that's a monotype. Degas, Cassatt, and Pissarro as well would take this further, and they would sometimes make a second or third stage, meaning you take a second sheet of paper, place it over the plate, and you take a second pull or a third pull, and you have a more shallow, a less colorful impression. And that's what you have here. This is most likely a first stage, which is then worked up into pastel. So in 1892 in the summer, he creates at least 23, maybe more, of these small-scale landscapes. And he writes to Durand-Ruel, who's been his dealer for a long time, but he also plays Durand-Ruel off of other dealers. He had at least 5 dealers in Paris, but Durand-Ruel was the principal dealer. And he tells Durand-Ruel, I have these landscapes, and I would like a one-man show. This is the first and only time Degas will ever have a solo exhibition. He didn't really care about a solo exhibition. He was very shrewd about making money, especially after 1874, and he and Mary Cassatt becomes friends. His father has died, the allowance is gone, and he has to earn a living. And so he becomes very shrewd. But supposedly, and this story I think is crazy enough to be true, Degas wanted to buy a book. It was a very slick, new English edition of the Arabian Nights, but it was very expensive. And so he's having dinner with his artist friend Jonio and others one night, and they're having dinner, and he says, I'm going to buy the new edition of Arabian Nights in London. And everyone says, well, how on earth are you going to pay for this thing? And he said, I have 24 landscapes, and I've just sold them to Durand-Ruel for 1,000 francs apiece. I'm buying my book. And so that's the reason, the impetus for the exhibition. Critics were incredibly receptive about this exhibition. One critic, and I'm paraphrasing, described the monotype landscapes with pastel as sapphires framed in jewel boxes. We would love to know what the original frames look like, as one scholar, D.M.F.A. Boston, has described, who about 3 years ago tried very well and very successfully to practically recreate that 1892 Durand-Ruel exhibition. But this, we think, is one of those 24 landscapes that was shown at Durand-Ruel in 1892. So again, keep an eye on the market, 1,000 francs in 1892. That's what Durand-Ruel will pay Degas for, and then he'll mark them up to sell them to clients like Louisine. Another artist, Camille Pissarro, experimented with monotype, but he never took it to the degree of Cassatt and Degas. So his monotypes are very rare. This is one of the very few, and it's right behind this wall in our vault. This is another of the 65 gifts by Isaac and Yolande Melman of landscape of the forest with figure. Very faint, very rich at the same time, and shows enormous Japanese influence. And you can see where he signed it just by putting his finger. It's about 4 by 7 inches. It's a treasure. But Cassatt wanted to go further, always. Of all the Impressionists, Mary Cassatt was really the most disciplined, the most driven, the most ambitious. And she didn't have to be. She had enormous financial resources at her disposal. But she had this inner drive to become the best artist ever. So after the 1860s, after Japan begins to reestablish trade and communication with the the West, hundreds, if not thousands, of works of Japanese art begin flooding into Europe and America. And so Mary Cassatt is studying things like the antique Japanese woodblock print on the right, which influences the painting girl adjusting her hair in the center. Also, again, the Chesterfield collection that would go into the National Gallery. And then this color aqua tint, La Coiffure. And so of all the Impressionists, and they were all influenced by the Japanese, but Cassatt was the most influenced of all of them. And she had the most literal translation of Japanese influence into her work when she created this series of color aqua tints, because she said she dreamed of color on copper. So this isn't woodblock print. This is copper aqua tint, where you take an acidic brush and you bite into the plate, and then you ink it. You ink the plate in various colors, and so it looks drawn. She said, I imagine color on copper. Durand-Ruel thought the series would do well. It didn't do so well in France, and it did okay in America, but she thought the Americans should like her work more than they did. But today, these are considered great masterpieces of experimental avant-garde printmaking. And I'll just say that I think it was 3 or 4 years ago when we staged the exhibition When East Meets West. We borrowed an impression of this color aqua tint from our friends at the University of Georgia, and we were able to put it next to this 19th century Japanese woodblock print by Yoshito Shi, also a gift from Isaac and Yolanda Melamed. And the ability to put these two works side by side for the benefit of our students is immeasurable. So again, as the decades progress, Degas continues to focus on dancers, bathers, prostitutes. This is a lovely study of dancers, also from the 1918-1919 auctions in Paris. And this one also ended up in Atlanta. This is also with our neighbors at the High Museum. So you may have seen this work on view occasionally. Now, The Little Dancer, age 14. It's one of Degas' most famous works. Which one's the original and which one's a later copy?
Original?
Yeah, which one is the original and which one's a later copy?
The one on the right is the original.
One on the right's original. Why do you think it's original?
I guess the dress looks a little worn.
Good.
The wood on the bottom, like unstained, unfurbished.
Rough. Good. Anybody else? Jordan, what do you think?
I mean, I like the pieces, but I'm actually I would agree with that, because I feel like if you were to the copy would look shinier and newer and kind of like produced.
Jordan was always one of my best students. The piece on your right is indeed the original, made in wax. Degas exhibited the piece in around 1881, and then never showed it again, and never showed any of the other wax sculptures at all. It lived in his various homes in a glass vitrine, and Louisine Havemeyer tried for years to buy it from Degas, and he would never agree. He'd keep it not in the studio portion of his home, but in the living quarters of his home. And so this is the original. After Degas died, the waxes were some of the things the family chose not to sell. Instead, in 1922, they took them to a foundry and they cast a number of examples in bronze. And this is the later bronze example. And this is what Louisine bought. This lives in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. This lives at the Met. The tutu was replaced in 2000. Everything on the wax is utterly original. Now, also during the latter part of the 19th century, Louisine Havemeyer continues to buy with incredible aggression, and I mean that with the greatest of respect. Dancers Practicing at the Bar was painted in 1877. Degas had a great French collector, Monsieur Rosa, who had another Degas that either needed some conservation or needed to be reworked, or the patron wanted it to be reworked. And Degas took that other painting into the studio And when he was reworking it, an accident occurred, and Degas destroyed the painting. And so Degas went into his inventory stock in his studio, what to give to be in that room, and he pulled that off the shelf, and he gave it to the patron as a replacement. When that individual passed away in the late 1800s, and Degas is still alive at this point, there was an enormous auction of that collector's estate. Louisine Hebemeyer paid 450,000 francs for that picture through the good work of Durand Ruel, who was acting as her agent. That translates to about $89,000 in 1890 money. It was a world record. Before that, this was one of the great world records for living artists. This is Rosa Bonheur's Horse Fair, 8 feet by 16 feet. It was painted in the 1850s, around 1853 to 55. It was eventually bought for 44,000 francs by a British art dealer. When Victoria wanted to have a look, it was brought to Buckingham Palace. She decided she didn't like it after all. Ultimately, it came to the United States, and in the late 1870s, early 1880s, it was put up for auction. And Cornelius Vanderbilt II bought it for over $50,000, which was a world record. But Cornelius is spending $50,000, Louisine is spending $80,000, not too many years later. So you can see this enormous escalation in value even before the artist's death. And this piece, by the way, is now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art as part of Louisine's request. The Rosa Bonheur was immediately given to the Metropolitan by Cornelius Vanderbilt II, and he bought this at auction in the late 1870s, early 1880s. Now, Louisine did not get Little Dancer age 14 with the original wax. It would stay in the family's possession, and eventually in the 1950s, it and several other wax models were sent to a gallery in the United States. Paul Melman. Paul Melman, the son of Andrew Melman, who was the founder of the National Gallery. By the 1950s, Mr. Melman's first wife, Mary, has died. He marries his second wife, Rachel, known as Bunny, to her friends and intimates and family members. And Mr. Melman's taste goes from more conservative British sporting art to French 19th and 20th century, because Bunny likes French art. And so Mr. Melman saw the Degas, along with other sculptures by Degas, and he thought about it for overnight, and then he bought the entire collection because he's Mr. Melman. And so it eventually went, after his death, to the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. But in the meantime, he sent it to Upperville, Virginia. He was given Rookaby Farms in the 1930s, thereabouts. It was supposed to be a consolation to his mother as part of her divorce settlement from his father. But Norma McMullen did not like horses, so she gave the farm to her son. And Mr. Melman continued to buy adjoining acreage until, at its peak, Rookaby Farms encompassed more than 4,000 acres. This was the main house that he and Mary lived in, his first wife, during their marriage. After the second Mrs. Melman comes on the scene, who was his neighbor at the adjoining farm, and she decided that she would leave her first husband, and Mr. Melman was a better prospect. She married Paul Melman. She found this house to be not to her liking, and so Mr. Melman said, "That's fine. We're running out of space. I need more walls for my art collection," and this became an art gallery. This has now been sold off from the estate. This is where Bunny Melman liked to live. This is Oak Spring Gardens, yes. It's another part of the estate. And these are a series of new and old structures that Mrs. Melman had moved onto site, because you're Mrs. Melman and you can do that. She was one of the greatest landscape garden designers of all times. She was a close intimate to Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. When the Rose Garden was to be built, it was Mrs. Melman who designed it. And so Mrs. Melman lived here in Upperville, Virginia, along with other homes around the world. This was her seat in Upperville, which is near an hour from Washington, D.C. It's a beautiful horse country. She lived here well past 100 years of age. After her death, she left the bulk of her fortune to the Oak Spring Garden Foundation. You can go here today by appointment, and you can visit and study horticultural arts and history of art as they relate to gardening, flora, fauna, and botany. But again, this is what you would call the back lawn This was Mrs. Melman's dressing room, so she could actually work out on the gardens every day when she was in residence. She had an enormous staff, especially gardening staff. No one was allowed to prune a branch wider than their thumb without Mrs. Melman's express permission. She was very strict. This was her great crabapple arbor, which connects the garden we just saw to the glass house at the end of the day. And if you go there today, it looks just like this. Now, we're going to change gears slightly. I've been talking for a very long time, so I promise we're coming to an end of the narrative. But we've talked about the female characters in the life of Edgar Degas. And another very important character who's just now becoming more important in scholarship, being reassessed, is Suzanne Valedon. And this is one of her great masterpieces, The Blue Room, in the National Museum of Modern Art in Paris. Suzanne Valedon was born into an incredibly poor family. The father was never present. Her mother was a laundress and an alcoholic. And Suzanne really did not like school. She didn't like the nuns. She thought they were a bit severe. And she liked to spend time on the streets of Montmartre with prostitutes, artists, and poets. And so from a very young age, she rebels. You see her here as a very beautiful young woman with her son, the artist Maurice Trillo. But to think about Suzanne Valedon, it's important first to compare her with a woman one generation behind, which is Berthe Morisot. Berthe Morisot was the second primary female character in the cast of Impressionists. Like Mary Cassatt, she came from a very wealthy family, but she was not American, she was French. She was very enamored with Edvard Manet, and he was very enamored with her. The only problem was Suzanne Manet was on the scene. And Suzanne Manet had been brought into the Manet household, they were very bourgeois, upper middle class, as a piano instructor. And she had a relationship, an affair with either Edvard, his brother, or his father, we're not sure who, but a child was on the way. And so it was decided that Edvard Manet would marry Suzanne, and they lived together. Unfortunately, this meant that Berthe Morisot couldn't marry him, but she had very strong feelings for Eugene, Edvard's brother, who was even better looking, in my opinion. And so they did marry, and Eugene was very liberal, he was very open-minded, and he allowed Berthe Morisot to continue to work and practice as an artist. This is the last painting that his brother Edvard Manet ever painted of Morisot. And you see how she's lifted her finger to show the engagement ring. So this is a farewell piece. But Manet was incredibly enamored with Berthe Morisot, who was not only beautiful but a brilliant artist. The diaphanous depiction of this black fabric is very influenced by Diego Velázquez. Velázquez influenced a lot of these artists, like Manet and Cassatt and others, because no one could paint fabric like Diego Velázquez. And this is a wonderful small picture painted by Berthe Morisot on the Isle of Wight during the honeymoon with Eugene Manet. But getting back to Berthe Morisot, you see this very telling photograph of her with her mother, who was a very unhappy, stern, terrible woman. But Berthe Morisot was determined, Suzanne Valedon was determined to make something of her life. And so she withdrew from school at a young age, worked as a waitress in a cafe. Then she decided to work for the circus because she always liked horses. Unfortunately, she tried her hand at the trapeze act one time only, fell and almost broke her back. And then she decided that she saw these beautiful women gathering in a fountain in a park in Paris every day. And they were there to be chosen, judged, and selected by artists for models. Mm-hmm. And she decided she would become an artist model because she was beautiful and she had an interest in art. This is the first picture she ever modeled for, we think, and this is by Pierre Chavans, who was a pretty good 19th century French artist who himself was kept up by another woman. He used that money to support Suzanne. She lived with him. He would go to his mistress's home occasionally. And this arrangement lasted about 6 to 12 months. And ultimately, Suzanne decided she wanted her freedom, so she withdrew back to her mother's small little flat. This is a magnificent example also of Suzanne Valedon modeling for an artist. This is an atypical work, and the artist is Renoir. This is a much more conservative, earlier style. But all of the artists that she modeled for greatly admired her and respected her. And this is another wonderful Renoir. You may remember it was hanging in the Ranouel's salon, one of the earlier photographs. This is sort of a more formal pose. These are two depictions of the same model by Toulouse-Lautrec, very formal, and then the absent drinker, which is a much more casual subject. And she modeled for Edgar Degas as well. And when she modeled for these artists, when she was a young woman, she expressed an interest in becoming an artist herself. And everybody encouraged her and said, you should do this, you have good innate talent. But this picture is important because it's a documented example of Suzanne Valedon sitting for Edgar Degas. And we're currently conducting research to try to prove that our picture also depicts Suzanne Valedon. We know that it dates to 1884. That was the year after Maurice Trillo was born. He was born in the latter part of 83. And you see this rather pronounced stomach that could indicate she's recently given birth to a child. Our work was drawn from life in the studio. Degas used it for the rest of his life as a prototype, and he created, this is the most literal translation. This is the collection of Sao Paulo Musa in Brazil. Again, that pronounced stomach. And then a slightly different variation in color pastel in the National Gallery in London. Our charcoal is very important regardless, but I personally would like to see if we could connect it to Suzanne Valedon, because I think that would make it doubly important. This is one of the early attempts by Valedon at self-portraiture. It's a bit of a timid painting, but you see talent coming through in it. And like Degas, she liked these bathing scenes, but she also especially liked to focus on women, but women who looked like real women. These were not glossy, they were not glorified, they were not a male interpretation of a woman. And one of the critics of Valedon said once, Suzanne Valedon must have never met a woman in her life. Because all the other artists painted women the way men wanted them to look. Valedon painted them the way they did look. This is a wonderful dry point, again, a bathing scene. The plate, when I say plate, proportion is 18 center. The plate is about 6 inches by 6 inches square. It came to auction about 2 months ago. Elizabeth and I decided we wanted to try for it. The estimate was ridiculously low, something like 300 to 400 euros, and we were outbid. It sold for 5 times that amount. This rather wonderful pastel, about 4 by 9 inches, also came to market about 3 months ago. It sold for 8,000 euros, which again is ridiculous when you think about what Degas Cassatt is selling for right now. So we're trying very hard to acquire something by Valedon very soon. Again, Ambrose Velard was one of the great dealers. He was the second generation of dealers. He came into the scene, he did business with Degas and Cassatt, but he also did a great deal with Suzanne Valedon, and he also played a pivotal role in Picasso. Mary Cassatt, by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, has amassed enormous fortune in her own right, and she buys this wonderful Chateau Beaufry in the countryside, where she lives most of the time, although there are times during the First World War where she may have to evacuate. In the late 1890s, she was also approached by the International Exposition in the United States to create a mural for the Women's Pavilion, and the top image shows the central panel. Sadly, the work is lost. We didn't know how it was destroyed, but it's no longer known to us. And at first, Cassatt really didn't want to go back to the United States for this commission, but then Edgar Degas found out that she was given permission, and he was furious, and so she was thrilled, and she decided to go to the United States and carry out this commission. But it shows the subject of women empowering one generation to the other in the arts and sciences. Also in the late 19th century, Claude Monet has also begun to attain financial freedom and success. He initially bought the house at Giverny with a loan from Emmanuel, but it would go on to become his own right, and he would live here for the rest of his life. Mary Cassatt in the late 1900s, about 1917, her health is beginning to decline. She'll live until 1926, thereabouts. But she remained close to Degas until the very end. He, again, moved homes a number of times throughout France, throughout Paris. And in the last house, the niece of Degas recommended that Cassatt move in with him to help look after him, but she declined. She simply kept close watch on him. And again, as I mentioned, when this work came to market, Louisine Hebemeyer paid over 450,000 francs for it. At the end of Cassatt's life, her parents had died. Her sister, with whom she was very close, Louise, died much too soon. We believe it was Bright's disease. Mary Cassatt always thought her sister would live on, and they would live together, and that things would be fine. And when her sister died, she went into severe depression and wouldn't touch a paintbrush for 6 months. And she said to a friend, perhaps I should have married. Now I'm alone, what am I going to do? And eventually this woman came onto the scene, Mathilde Vallée, who became Cassatt's housekeeper, companion, and friend. This is a portrait of Mathilde Vallée by Mary Cassatt, which is now in the National Gallery collection in DC. And when Cassatt, this is taken just 1 year before her death, I love this photograph because she looks so empowering and so matriarchal, and she's done exactly what she wanted to do with her life. She wanted to come up with a way to ensure the financial success, financial security of Mathilde Vallée. And rather than just giving Mathilde a large sum of money or an annuity or an insurance policy, Mary Cassatt was very shrewd and smart, and she thought that her work might escalate in value after her death, just as Edgar Degas had done. Because she went to the auctions in 1918, 1919, and saw the prices being realized for those works, including some of her own work that Degas collected was sold at Galerie Georges Petit and Hotel Drouot. So she chose about 100 works on paper, prints, drawings, watercolors, pastels, and she set them aside, and she instructed her attorneys and her executors to give those 100 works of art to Mathilde at the time of her death. Mathilde was equally shrewd. She divided the inheritance into 2 halves, and Hotel Drouot had 2 auctions 7 years apart, and every piece was stamped with the collector's mark, Collection Mathilde X, Mary Cassatt. So if you ever see a work on paper by Cassatt with that stamp, you know that it's one of the 100 pieces that Mary Cassatt chose for Mathilde Vallée. They were sold 2 separate sales at auction, huge prices, and Mathilde lived the rest of her life in financial security and comfort. Now, getting back to Suzanne Valedon, you see her here later in life with this wonderful, equally imposing self-portrait. She also achieved great financial and artistic success by the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s, and she's showing in London, Paris, and the United States. This is a more complex and involved self-portrait than the first one we saw. And like Degas, she's also very interested in this subject matter of female gender, female sexuality. And this work is entitled The Doll, which you see on the floor here, and a young woman who is about to enter womanhood, which is very similar yet quite different from the interior of the 1860s, but still very much related. And the Blue Room, one of her great masterpieces. And again, just a few comparisons. You see what Suzanne Valedon's doing in the early 20th century compared to Manet. Similar but different, every bit as good. She's turning things on an angle. She's also looking at Gauguin. She's looking at Cézanne. So this is Suzanne's, and this is Gauguin, Cézanne's references. And then mending the nets, it's about 6 by 8 feet monumental picture. She's not afraid to show the male nude as well, and she does it incredibly well. Now, part of this is something artists have been doing for a very long time. You show the same figure in 3 separate poses, different angles of the body. Van Dyck did it 300 years earlier with Charles I to show the profile, front, and angle, because this work is being sent to Rome for John Lorenzo Bernini to sculpt the bust of the king, because Charles I could not go to Rome. It was considered such a great masterpiece that Bernini and his heirs kept it for 200 years, and in the late 18th, early 19th century, King George IV bought it from the heirs of Bernini, and it now hangs in Windsor Castle. It's in the royal collection. But Valedon, again, great, imposing matriarch. Her mother is sitting off in the wind. Her husband, André Outer, was never as good as his mother. I'm sorry, forgive me. André Outer looking off obliviously, and then Maurice Trillo, who was as good as his mother, but would suffer from alcoholism for years. And early on, in his late teens, when he had to be the first time he had to be institutionalized in a sanitarium for alcoholism, it was Suzanne Valedon who said you should turn to painting as a therapeutic form to solve this problem. but still very melancholy in this group portrait. Suzanne is the only one engaging the viewer. And here, things are beginning to look a little better because Suzanne Valedon and Marisa Trillo are beginning to have wonderful exhibitions and one-woman shows, one-man shows. Andre Luthier, who never was as good an artist, is now taking second stage. He's becoming more of a business manager for the family. He'll continue to have numerous affairs, which Suzanne really doesn't care about as long as it doesn't interfere with her artistic production and her money. She's showing at Bernheim June in the first decades of the 20th century. And like Mary Cassatt and others, she can now buy her own place in the country. And this is La Chateau de Saint-Bernard, which Valedon bought in the first quarter of the 20th century. She thought it would help rehabilitate her marriage. It didn't. Her husband grew more resentful. He also resented very much the focus that Suzanne placed on Maurice, who was constantly suffering from alcoholism. This is how it appeared when Suzanne bought it, and this is how it appeared when her son Maurice painted it. And so Maurice returns to the old stomping ground of Montmartre. His work is incredibly well received, and after Suzanne Valedon's death, she's largely forgotten. Marisa Trillo continues to skyrocket after his death. His work becomes even more important and is now shown here at the Barnes collection in Philadelphia. Mr. Barnes bought a lot of Marisa Trillo's. He bought nothing by Suzanne Valedon. But I'm pleased to say, as we bring this to an end, that as we speak, there is the first major retrospective of Suzanne Valedon at the Barnes collection now. We're also, again, working with the curators of that exhibition to try to confirm if the Oglethorpe Degas does in fact depict Suzanne Valedon. So that's a long way to get there, but thank you. I went on far too long, but I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. Yes, Jay?
Well, with what you were showing here toward the end of your speech, it sort of made me think of the title of our piece here is the Femme assise, ancestral. And I think that's kind of a, you know, translated, but it doesn't come across very well in English. You know, essuyer is to wipe.
Right.
And I was just, I was struck by the extent to which you showed other figures. I would think also Cézanne's The Bathers, Zizan. There's something with this white that that's kind of hard to express.
Right. And I'm not quite sure why they were so involved and interested in this physical act of bathing, the wiping. But it seems something that interested a lot of them. Yes?
You spoke about the prints, the copper prints. What size are these?
Good question. So they tend to be fairly small because you have to have a copper plate the same size as the print. Copper can be an expensive metal. But in the case of, let me get back to this one, it's about 6 inches square and then printed on a larger sheet of paper so you have the margins. And it's signed in the plate but also in the margin. In the case of Mary Cassatt, Le Coiffure Bouvard of Georges Bouvard, it's about 8 by 11 inches. And again, signed and noted, there's a dedication from the artist on the margin. But that's maybe 6 to 8 by about 10 to 11, you know, but not huge.
Is that an impression as well? Like they take a piece of copper and press it on?
But this is a color aquatint, so you have to do multiple pulls for every color. It's similar to woodblock, so this is printed off of woodblock, and you have to pull for every color. And Cassatt, because she was so brilliant, she wanted to try to do the same thing in copper, which is incredibly difficult. Anything else? Well, thank you all again.